Hello, everybody. Okay, my name is Tom. Thanks so much for joining me today for a really cool topic that I think is really important and actually really interesting because there's lots of different components we can talk about. So today we are going to talk about food webs and energy flow throughout different environments. So we are going to talk about what a food web is, why they're really important, and how we can kind of understand them and why it's important to understand them. And then we'll show a couple cool examples. So before I start talking about a food web, I figured it could be useful to talk about a food chain and what that is, because you will see how that is going to play into the importance of a food web, and that will help us kind of understand what's happening throughout food webs. So starting with a food chain, I thought I would just give you a brief understanding of what it is. So a food chain is a way for us to monitor how energy and nutrients move up that chain. So it's the transfer of nutrients and energy from one level to another. And so what those nutrients and energy are transferring through are what we call different trophic levels. And so what those are different groups of animals essentially within a food chain and therefore a food web. And so we have our different components of our trophic levels. So we start with our primary producers, and then we go into our primary consumers, our secondary consumers, our tertiary consumers, and then we can have a couple other levels sometimes depending on the environment or the community that is found there. But really what I want you to take away is that we start with primary producers and then move into our consumers. So let's start talking about our primary producers because they are very important and it's useful to know what we are referencing. So our primary producers are what we call autotrophs. They are called autotrophs because they make their own food. For them to have energy, they need to make it. And these are things like our plants. So our plants are our primary producers. There are some other ones, but that's what we're going to focus on. And so the way that they make their own energy is through making their own food through a process known as photosynthesis. So all of our primary producers need resources. So they need things like sunlight and water and carbon dioxide and nutrients. And even if we think about it, they need appropriate temperatures for growing. And so through that process of photosynthesis, really briefly, what they do is they use their leaves, they collect sunlight, and they use energy from that sunlight to kind of combine that carbon dioxide in the water, which they also need for the plant. And through that process of photosynthesis and making or combining that water and carbon dioxide, they make their own food. They make glucose or sugars that they use as an energy source that can be used for growth. So that's really brief, but what's really important is to note that primary producers are very important. They are the foundation for most ecosystems and environments. They are the initial food source, and then, right, like I was talking about, energy is going to move up from there. So having an understanding that primary producers are very important is very important because they are, again, the foundation or the initial source for all of the energy and food that's going to move further up that food web as we talked about. Okay, so that's our primary producers. And then we have our primary consumers. So these are usually our herbivores, which means these are animals that are going to be eating our primary producers or our plants. And so that's our next level up in our trophic cascade. So there are lots of examples of primary consumers. It's anything that eats plant material. So it can be things like insects, it can be things like turtles or tortoises, it can be things like grazers like deer or any other animals. There's a lot of birds that will feed primarily on things like seeds and nuts and vegetation. So lots of examples of things that can be primary consumers or our herbivores. And then we can move up another level to our third level, which is our secondary consumers. So now these are animals that are going to eat our primary consumers. So now these are animals eating animals, which means we oftentimes find carnivores at this trophic level. So lots of examples of carnivores. I'm going to show you an example, so I won't touch on that too much right now, but it's our carnivores. It's animals that eat our secondary or our primary consumers, so they are going to be carnivores now. And then we can go up another level, depending on the environment and the ecosystem. And then we're getting into things like our tertiary consumers. So now we're getting into things that fall higher in the food chain, so our really effective predators. These can be, depending on the ecosystem, this could be like our apex predator at the top of the food chain. Nothing else is going to eat them. So these can be things like our birds of prey are really effective hunters and animals like that. Okay, so what I thought would be helpful is so we can talk about too, so what's useful to note is that when working up a food chain, you'll oftentimes notice that there are less of those animals further up at the top of the food chain than lower down. So we can find lots of insects, grasshoppers, for example, that are herbivores, are everywhere. Plants are everywhere, but we don't have just swarms of, let's say, bald eagles, right? Because they're at the top of our food chain. So you'll oftentimes notice that our apex predators or our tertiary consumers at the top of the food chain, there's not as many of them as animals in our primary consumer level, right? And that's because energy is lost each trophic level it goes up. So as a rule of thumb, only about 10% of the energy that's found at the trophic level below you is going to get transferred up to your trophic level. So there's a 10% loss every time, or only 10% is going to get transferred every time you go up. And the reason that is because energy is burned, or that food source and nutrients is burned each time at each level. So if you think about it, one way it's burned is just the processing of food. Heat or energy is lost through the metabolism of animals at all levels. So especially, let's think about things like endotherms, animals that need to produce their own body heat. A lot of the energy they're consuming is going to go directly towards keeping themselves warm. And when they're doing that, they're losing energy. And that's one of the reasons they feed, is because they have to have enough energy to run their metabolism and keep themselves warm. And so a lot of energy is lost that way. So if you think about it, not all of the energy they eat from the level below them is going to get to go passed up. They're losing a lot of it to things like heat production. And so just a lot of energy in general is lost as heat. And so really the only energy that's going to get passed up into the next trophic level is the energy and the nutrients that goes directly towards growth or increase in mass. But again, not all of that is the case. A lot of it is used for other things. So that's why you will oftentimes find larger animals up at trophic scales, but not as much overall biomass. Even though animals are much smaller, because there's much more of them, overall biomass is actually going to be found in those lower trophic levels. So that's pretty interesting. Another reason that we're going to lose a lot of energy or nutrients as we move up a food chain is because animals don't eat full animals, right? Bones are left behind. We have to put energy and nutrients into building our bones and growing our bones. So when bones are left behind, so is some of the energy that was put into building those or making those. Even just, not 100% of animals are picked apart. So, when an eagle eats a mouse or something smaller, let's say, or something larger, they're not going to pick apart every single piece of it. They might, but they might leave some behind. And so that's another reason that energy can get lost. And so there's a number of different reasons, but overall, that's why you'll see less apex predators. And then the reason we really only max out at around 4 or 5 different trophic levels is because there's just not, by the time all of that energy is lost moving up the chain, there may not be enough energy to support another level after that. So it kind of balances out or trails off at about our 4th or 5th trophic level. So pretty interesting to think about. Okay, So what I thought I would do next is I will share my screen with you, and we'll do a little bit of an activity to demonstrate a food chain. So I'm going to do that now. And so what I have here, I guess I need to leave it like this, is 4 different animals or plants. And what I figured we would do is try to figure out where each one is going to go. So if anybody has any ideas, I'm open to suggestions as to what we think is going to go at the bottom of our food chain. So right now, we are only looking at one pathway. So this is a food chain, how energy is going to move throughout these different levels. So I'm going to go ahead and, yep, we're going to drag our plants here down to the bottom. So that's our primary producer, right? That's going to be the foundation for this food chain. That those plants there, looks like corn, is pulling in all of the energy from the sunlight and growing. And then any ideas as to what's going to be next? Sure, we can have our grasshopper here. So that is an herbivore that's going to be feeding on those plants. And then you can probably guess that next is going to be our frog here. So our frog is going to be our primary or our secondary consumer. Sorry, our grasshopper was our primary consumer. It was our herbivore feeding on the plants. Now we have our secondary consumer. So this frog here is a carnivore. It's going to feed on things like this grasshopper. And then at the top of our food chain, this leaves our snake. So just for simplicity, this snake is going to fall at the top of our food chain. We'll consider this our apex predator, although we probably know that a lot of things can also eat snakes, like birds. But I just wanted to demonstrate here an example of a food chain. So this is just one way that we can look at how energy is going to get transferred throughout that chain. It's going to move up those levels. And if you think about it, just through a simple walkthrough, you could probably find many more grasshoppers and corn stalks than you could snakes, right? And again, that's because there's not as much energy available to support many of these snakes higher up in the food chain. And so while they are larger, there's going to be less of them because they are going to require more energy. So they're going to have to feed a lot more on these other animals. Okay, so that is our first food chain. But before I move on, what I figured I'd mention is we can also talk about food webs. So a food chain is nice for looking at one pathway or way in which energy and nutrients can be transferred up a chain in an ecosystem. But oftentimes food chains may not be the most useful because they're oversimplified and they're not going to be really representative of all the ways in which energy can move throughout an ecosystem. And so what we'll oftentimes look at is what we call a food web. And so a food web is made up of several different food chains, all interlinked, all combined. And so a food web is a better way to look at all of the pathways or food chains in which energy and nutrients can be transferred from one trophic level to another. And so it's really more of a community-wide, a whole, environmental community-wide look at movement of energy throughout that environment or that ecosystem. So what I've done is I've introduced here, you can see I have my food chain that we created in the last slide, but now I've introduced 3 new animals. So let's see if we can figure out where they would kind of fall. So what I'm going to jump to is the easy one. So out of these 3 animals, one of these is going to be our apex predator. And that's probably going to be this eagle, right? That's probably going to be our top predator here in this environment. And then we can have other things like this mouse, this field mouse. That's probably going to be also falling in the range of an herbivore, right? And then we have here a bird, another bird that can be found over here. And this bird is primarily an insectivore, we'll say. So this is what we're going to consider an insectivore. So still kind of a carnivore. So a mid-level predator, kind of like our frog here. So that's why I have him over here. But oftentimes mice here can be what we call, so this is another variation, which is why food chains can be a little oversimplified. This is what we would call an omnivore. So what that means is that this mouse could feed on, and I'm going to demonstrate this, both our plants. Uh-oh, didn't like that. Both our plants and our little insects here. Oh, doesn't like that either. Maybe we'll do this. Oh no. All right. Well, either way, you can see we have two arrows. One from the insect, one from our plant. And so just by adding one more animal to our food chain, sorry for those technical difficulties, you can see that we've added two more pathways or ways in which energy can move throughout the food chain. And then by adding that animal, now we have another way for the grasshopper to transfer nutrients further up the food chain, because then this bird can also be consumed by the snake. And also, there's nothing saying that this eagle couldn't eat this bird. And then we can have our eagle eat our mouse, right? There's nothing saying that can't happen. He could eat, or the eagle could eat the snake. What else could happen here? Probably could eat the frog too. That eagle could probably eat most things, right? That snake could for sure eat the mouse, which it's probably going to prefer, right? That's going to be a nice energy source, an easy prey. So what you can see is that now we have many different sources of food for different animals, lots of links. So thinking that that snake could get food from just one animal, which was that frog, is a bit simplified, right? We can see that it could eat a bird, it could eat a frog, it could eat that mouse. So just by adding two other animals, we have now three sources of food for that snake versus just one. And so this is a better idea of how a food web can look at how all of the different ways in which energy and nutrients can be moved throughout this field environment. Okay, so I really want to demonstrate that food chains are oversimplified, and we should oftentimes look at food webs because that's going to be really important. But let's talk about how we as people also play a very big role in food webs and ecosystems in general. So when we are out at farms, we oftentimes include things like insecticides to make sure all of our crops aren't getting eaten by pests. And so let's say we use insecticides and we get rid of our grasshoppers. Let's look at just how one change to a food chain can alter the rest of it. So let's say our insecticides get rid of our grasshoppers. We've now just lost a source of food to our mouse and to our frog. And what are we going to notice? Our only source of food going to that frog was just lost. And that bird was also an insectivore and just lost its only food source. That chain just got dropped. And so now our frog is gone. And our insectivore gone, which now just took away another food source from our eagles and our birds. Fortunately, that snake can still feed on that mouse, but what you'll probably notice is we just moved a little bit more towards a food chain, right? Although I shouldn't say that, because we could still have our mouse feeding our eagle. So our eagle could still feed on one of these two items, our snake or our mouse, right? So you could still have two different food options. But what else do you think is going to happen to the eagle? We're probably not going to be able to support as many snakes, because the snake just lost two of its food sources, and the eagle, therefore, is now losing a food source in that bird. So there may be less potential for energy to get moved through, and less opportunities, and it may be more difficult for this bird to find prey. So maybe their numbers would be reduced too. In general, what I wanted you to take away from that is that humans do play a very important role in food webs. We do have to be cautious of what we're doing in all of our actions, because by just doing something like using an insecticide, we could knock out whole portions of a food web, and that effect is going to trickle up the trophic levels and potentially even impact animals further up. And we don't want to lose any animals from our environment. So just thought it'd be really interesting to kind of demonstrate how just one example of a human behavior or action can alter a community within an ecosystem like this. And so it's really important to make sure we're considering ourselves now part of all food webs, because we are going to have an impact on environments and ecosystems, and therefore the communities, the ecological communities found within those environments. So let's talk about some ways that we can make sure we don't have a situation like this happening, which is we can be aware of what kinds of insecticides we're using, that are targeting, hopefully, actual pests and not necessarily things just like grasshoppers, which could be important parts of communities. I wanted to provide another example of birds. So we had here our eagle right at the top of our food chain, but we have things that are also at the top of our food webs, like these apex predators, like predatory birds such as the red-shouldered hawk, which is going to feed on a lot of rodents and mice, and also a lot of animals like eagles, or not eagles, owls are going to feed on mice and rats, right? And so is there any ideas as to what we can do to help protect animals like this? We can try to move away from, and I would encourage everybody to move away from setting poison rat traps and get back to those kind of old-fashioned snap traps. And that's because when we think about it, we think we're killing the rat, right? And then it's dead. But what in reality happens is oftentimes a rat will eat that poison, but it doesn't die immediately. It'll run back out into the environment, and then it will die. Or an owl or a red-shouldered hawk is going to find it even before it dies, and they're going to eat that poisoned rat or mouse. And then not only is that eagle going to benefit from getting the nutrients, and that nutrients is going to move up the food web, but they're also going to get the poison. That really harmful chemical that's found in the rat is also going to be consumed and transferred into those higher trophic levels. And so that's going to potentially harm or kill animals at the top of our food chains and our food webs. And so I would encourage people to make sure they are not using poison. But we can also see this in a lot of systems. So I have here biomagnification, which I kind of wanted to talk about. And biomagnification is this idea that even if there's things like heavy metals in waters, or other pollutants in waters, things like that, those are going to be taken in by organisms in the water. So it could start as low as plankton, and then plankton's going to get eaten by smaller fish. Those smaller fish may get eaten by larger fish, so we're moving up the trophic levels, right? And then those larger fish may be eaten by, again, some predatory birds. But what's really important about biomagnification is that's also going to be a way for those pollutants or those heavy metals to work up the food chain, and that can also have some really big issues for animals throughout the food chain and the food web. And in fact, biomagnification is this idea that those pollutants actually get more concentrated as they move up the food chain because they can be consumed and ingested and collected within the bodies of larger animals faster than they can be broken down or released. And so because it can be accumulated faster than it can be broken down, it's actually going to magnify within those bodies. The concentration is going to become higher, which is why we call it biomagnification. And that can provide problems for us, right? So I was talking about it can start as low as plankton, and a little plankton, if we eat a little plankton, it's probably not going to hurt us, right? But then it's going to get into smaller fish, so now they're going to be eating several planktons, so they're going to start to accumulate a little bit more. And then larger fish are going to eat lots of smaller fish that have higher concentrations. So now those larger fish are going to have higher concentrations. And what do we as people eat? We eat fish, right? So now we have to be worried about how high are the levels of different toxins or anything that's or magnifying within animals. How high are those concentrations getting in? Is it still safe for us to eat those fish? And in what quantities can we eat those fish now? So definitely something to think about, how not only can energy and nutrients flow throughout environments and food webs, but so can other things. Other things can move through. And then I wanted to talk about this really cool. So kind of moving away from pollutants, we don't need to talk about that the whole time. But I just wanted to make everybody aware of it because I think it's kind of interesting to think about. But moving away from that, some cool ways in which we might not think about energy moving throughout environments is through this. Does anybody know what this is? This is a salamander larva. And so you can probably notice it has a tail fin. So this is just a still shot of it, but this organism would be found in an aquatic habitat like a pond or a wetland. And what's cool is we think about an ecosystem and food webs and food chains being within the water, being in terrestrial environments. But there can also be some really cool transfer of nutrients and energy from one habitat type to another within the same environment. So a lot of our amphibians, our frogs and salamanders, they're going to lay eggs in wetlands, in aquatic environments and habitats, and they're going to grow into things like this salamander larva. And so they're going to be eating food within their aquatic environments. And there's even many food chains and food webs within that environment, right? So this salamander larva is going to eat smaller little invertebrates, and they could be eaten by things like fish, depending on what kind of habitat they're in. So even food webs, they're going to impact and play roles within food webs there. But then that salamander larva is going to eventually metamorph into an animal, let's see, like this. Let's see if I can get a really good view. Like this marbled salamander. So this is still a younger salamander. But what I want you to note is that this no longer looks like that little salamander larva, right? That's because this is now a terrestrial animal. This is no longer an aquatic larval stage. It is metamorphed into a terrestrial animal. And so what do you think is going to happen when that aquatic larva moves into terrestrial environments? It is going to bring the nutrients and the energy that it had gained and had been building up while it's in that aquatic environment and moving it into terrestrial environments. So a really cool way to think about energy flow is that some organisms can actually move energy from one habitat type to another. And so they're an important source of energy transfer, is what we call it, from one type of environment or habitat to another. So something really cool to think about, these organisms are important. They have a tremendous amount of biomass in some instances. It can be a huge food source for things like snakes and birds. And so really cool to think about how we just think about tadpoles being in the water, right? But they are moving a lot of energy and nutrients from aquatic environments into terrestrial environments. So I thought it would be cool to talk about another really interesting way of transferring nutrients that we may not think about throughout our food webs. Because then once they move into terrestrial environments, they're going to become part of a whole new food web and movement of nutrients through different trophic levels out in that environment. So one more look at our really cool marbled salamander. I think they're super interesting. And then we can also talk about, one second while I put this guy away. And then we can talk about other animals that are carnivores within their environments. So kind of in a similar fashion, things like alligators are also going to play really important roles in controlling all of the different diversity of animals that are found in their environment, right? Because they are a top predator, and so they will feed on mid-level predators, those secondary and tertiary consumers, which then there's less of those to feed on smaller animals. So then there can be a greater diversity of things like our primary consumers. So there's lots of really cool ways to look at how just one animal can control kind of the foundation or the structure of the whole food web and move energy that way. And then there's one other group I wanted to talk about that we haven't really focused on yet. So we've been talking about how one animal is going to feed on another animal, but we haven't talked about our fungus yet, or our decomposers. So another big thing that we haven't talked about is what happens when, say, a tree falls down and it's been, building all this food and energy for all of these years. Trees get huge, right? But that whole time it had been putting energy, it had been photosynthesizing and pulling energy in from the sun. But when a tree falls, it just becomes kind of organic matter, right? Well, that's when our decomposers, like our fungus or our fungi and mushrooms, can come in. And what they do, or they are really important at breaking down organic matter. They are different from our autotrophs, which need to make their own food to get their energy. Our heterotrophs, which are our consumers that need to get their energy from eating other animals and plants. So they're different from autotrophs and heterotrophs in that they need to get their energy from consuming dead matter. So this can be things like fallen trees or plants, or it can even be things like waste or feeding on dead animals or things like those bones that are left over that still have a lot of energy in them, right? So mushrooms are just one example of a decomposer. But what I really wanted to focus on is the fact that even those sources of energy that may have been lost throughout those other food chains and food webs can still get recycled back into the environment and the ecosystem somehow. And a big example of this is mushrooms. So you can see this mushroom is found on a log, what it looks like, that is fallen. And so those are going to work on breaking down that fallen log and breaking it down in a way that they can get energy from it, but also they are going to recycle nutrients back into the environment, and nutrients that are actually really helpful for other plants that are going to help them become even taller and stronger. So a lot of plants can use the nutrients that are broken down and released back into the environment, recycled back into the environment by things like mushrooms. So another really important and critical step of how energy can get transferred. So we think about it going up a lot of times, but these mushrooms can actually break it down and put it back down into that initial source of energy, which we talked about, which is plants, right? Our foundation for all of our ecosystems and environments. So didn't want to forget about those because they're really cool. And that's pretty much everything I had for you. If we have any questions, just mentioned things like earthworms are another decomposer that can recycle things like leaf litter and put those nutrients back into the environment. So it doesn't necessarily just have to be mushrooms. We can think about like worms and stuff too. And with that, I don't see any questions. So I hope you all learned something today and enjoyed this. And we look forward to seeing you all again in the future. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a good one.